Hello, Delta Kappa members, fellow inductees. When they asked me to say a few words this evening, I said, well, what should I talk about? And they said, just say something inspiring. So that prompted me to think about times in my life, and in particular times as an MFT, that I've been inspired over the course of my path. And I have to start with my brother, Chris. Chris is 4 years older than me. And from a very young age, he knew that he wanted to be an electrical engineer. He had the certainty, the interest, the passion. Me, on the other hand, I had no idea what I wanted to do for a living or when I grew up. So I always looked to him as an inspiration. And I said, whatever it is I settle in on as a career, I hope I have as much passion and interest as he does. I started my college career at Nassau Community College on Long Island. And I started out by taking a lot of psych classes as electives because they were always the most interesting classes. And I was fortunate enough to have some professors that had clinical practices. And I really enjoyed when they would come in and tell stories of their clients, and I was really drawn to that. One in particular, one of my professors came in and he had been working with a guy, middle-aged guy, for about 8 or 9 months, and he felt really stuck with the guy. And he was dreading seeing the guy. He was bored with the sessions. He questioned whether he was doing anything good with the guy. And outside of the building he was practicing in, there was a small pond. And occasionally my professor would sit out by the pond in between sessions or over his lunch break, and he would sit and feed the ducks. So one day this dreaded client comes in, and on a whim, he says, hey, how would you feel about us having this session outside? The guy agreed. So for an hour, they sat on the bench by the pond and they fed the ducks. My professor said that it was the most profound thing because afterward, for weeks on end, the guy kept on referring to that day that we fed the ducks. And he said he never felt stuck with the client again, and the client underwent all sorts of changes. Now, at 19 years old, hearing this in a psych class, I really had no way of making sense of why this seemingly innocuous interaction could be so profound in a person's life. But I was definitely interested to learn more about that. I transferred to a school upstate New York for the rest of my undergraduate career in psychology. And when it came time to graduate, my psych professors, all they told me was, well, if you're going to go to grad school, go to grad school in psychology, either general psych or clinical psych or research in psych. So I did end up in a research psychology program. This was not a very good fit. It was about rats and mazes and anxiety levels and stress levels. And it was really nothing that I was interested in or drawn to by my undergraduate psychology classes. So I lasted about a year, and then I moved back to Long Island and I enrolled in a counseling psychology program at Hofstra University. I was fortunate that my first professor in the counseling psych class was the chair of the MFT department. I didn't even know what MFT was at the time, but I think she liked teaching the counseling psychology course because she could pluck people away from psychology and bring them over to MFT. And that's exactly what she did with me. So as soon as I was exposed to systemic ideas about non-pathology, strength-based ways of looking at people's problems, I was drawn in immediately. And I had a taste, if not a whole dose, of what my brother had with electrical engineering. It was at Hofstra that I heard stories about Carl Whitaker and how he would occasionally fall asleep in session. And when asked about this, he would say, when I'm working with a family with a schizophrenic or some other quote unquote crazy person, I want to be the craziest one in the room. And I thought, wow, this is a guy that is really committed to what he's doing, willing to take personal and professional risks. I learned about people like Murray Bowen and Carl Whitaker and others who were kicked out of psychiatry because their commitment to opening up the therapy process and focusing on family dynamics. I learned about the clinical wizardry of Milton Erickson and how he would use whatever a client is bringing in service of the therapeutic agenda. One of my favorite stories of Erickson is upon meeting a patient who had been convinced he was Jesus Christ. Erickson met the guy, stuck out his hand and said, "Hi, my name is Dr. Erickson. I understand you have experience as a carpenter." That's Erickson in a nutshell. One day, one of my professors at Hofstra brought in a stack of texts. It might as well have been sacred texts. And he held them up one by one for the class and told us why those were important books for the field of family therapy and why they were important to him personally. And he held up books like Minuchin's Families and Family Therapy, Lynn Hoffman's Foundations of Family Therapy, Jay Haley's Strategic Family Therapy. And the last book he held up was a book called The Aesthetics of Change by Brad Keeney. I read all these books, but I was particularly drawn to this last book, and I didn't really know why. I just couldn't put it down. I think the first time I read it, I probably only understood about 20%. In this book, Brad Keeney is taking the very dense ideas of Gregory Bateson on cybernetics and systems and feedback loops and translating them in a way that us clinicians can understand and make them useful in the work that we do. So I graduated from Hofstra, and at the time in New York, there was no state license for marriage and family therapy. They were one of 6 holdout states that didn't have a license. So my choice was to either get a job at the mall like some of the graduates were doing or go on for my PhD. I was thinking about moving to Florida, and I called the president of the Florida Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and she happened to say in our conversation that she was at a PhD program in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Now, I had done some research, and there was nothing with the AAMFT or anybody else about a family therapy program in South Florida. Well, it turns out it was at a university that was kind of known as a diploma mill, Nova University. And she told me the story because I was inquiring, like, tell me about this, because all I know of Nova is that it doesn't have a very good reputation. She said, well, the program was started by a guy that used to be the chair of the family therapy department at Texas Tech University. And she said he was a very gifted teacher, very charismatic person, clinician. The students loved him at Texas Tech. Unfortunately, the administration, not so much. And he read the writing on the wall. So he went out in search of a program where he could start up a new family therapy program. And he found Nova University in South Florida. He convinced the president to let him start a marriage and family therapy program. So then it goes back to his graduating class of PhD students at Texas Tech and said, look, the writing's on the wall for me here, and I'm probably going to get fired any day, but I found a new university where I'm going to start a family therapy program, and I'd like you all to come over and be the first graduating class and then the first faculty. Now, these were people that were already done with their coursework. They're about to graduate from a very reputable, known Texas Tech University. And out of 9 students, 8 of them picked up their lives, moved halfway across the country, graduated from the program as the first graduating class, and went on to become the faculty. And that's where I decided to go. And that person who started the class was Brad Keeney. Started the program was Brad Keeney, the same Brad Keeney whose Aesthetics of Change that I couldn't put his book down. And that's the same program at Nova University that about 1/3 of our faculty also went and graduated from. Inspiration doesn't always come from positive places. In 2005, not unlike oftentimes in South Florida, we have to deal with hurricanes. And Hurricane Wilma ripped through Fort Lauderdale and did severe damage to the area and to the building I was practicing in at the time. I had shared space with other therapists. And after the hurricane, the building was demolished. We all kind of went our separate ways. And when it came time for myself and a couple of the other therapists to rebuild our practice, we decided, let's do something different. Let's do something sort of creative, innovative, more collaborative. We had all been trained at the program at Nova, and we really valued the co-therapy that we did. We had the luxury of doing longer sessions. We utilized a one-way mirror and a team. And we said, let's bring these innovative, creative ways of doing therapy to a population in need. And we settled in on couples and started the Couples on the Brink project. That was over 15 years ago, and it's a retreat-like intensive couples therapy program, and it's still going strong today. So inspiration can come out of good things and certainly sometimes tragic things. About 2 years before that, so around 2003, Dr. Schooley and I would let each other know about different teaching assignments that we would hear about, mostly in South Florida, in-person teaching gigs. And one day she said to me, hey, there's a class I'm teaching for an online university, and it's in marriage and family therapy. And I thought, how in the world could you teach marriage and family therapy in an online environment? And that was my introduction to Capella. I think I was hired on as the fourth full-time faculty. Back then, the mental health counseling program and the family therapy program were merged into one. We have probably 24, 25 full-time faculty now in the MFT program and dozens of part-time faculty. Our program and our field has grown by leaps and bounds. I'm reminded of that in field work. About 10 years ago, my graduating fieldwork learners, maybe 2 or 3 were getting job offers. 5 years ago, maybe half of them, 5 or 6 out of 12, were getting job offers. Today, my fieldwork learners are getting job opportunities and job offers from the moment they set foot in internship 1. And oftentimes they're getting offered signing bonuses, which is unheard of in this field. This is a really exciting time to be hitting the field of mental health, and in particular, a really exciting time to be hitting the field of marriage and family therapy. In closing, I would like to read to you one of my favorite stories about Milton Erickson, and maybe it inspires some of you who have never heard of Erickson to pursue some of his work. A short article about a teaching tale from the legendary therapist Milton Erickson. Back in the 1950s, Milton Erickson, the godfather of hypnotherapy, talked to one of his clients, a Detroit physician, who asked him to do a favor. His client knew that Erickson had a speaking gig scheduled in Milwaukee, the same city where their client's beloved but severely depressed aunt lived. His client was worried, so he asked Erickson if he would look her up and see if he could help her in some way. Erickson agreed, so one day he knocked on the door of the lady. The door opened. There she was, an old rich lady withering away. The aunt was 53 years old, boy, doesn't seem very old now, and was living alone in a great big house with a great big yard. She was unmarried, had no children and no friends, and with that, no one to share her immense wealth with. Erickson found that she was an active and proud Christian who was active in her local church community in the past. Still, these days, she barely attended any of the services, and when she did, she didn't speak to anybody there. The only people in her life were her housekeeper and her maid, who came each morning to do the housework, prepare the meals, and wash the dishes. After the introduction, Erickson demanded that he be given a tour of the house because he wanted to inspect the house to get a clearer picture of the woman. She reluctantly agreed. All of the blinds were closed. The house was dark and deprived of color. It was gloomy, and you could see that the owner of the house was not happy. The last room the old lady showed Dr. Erickson could not be more different. It was full of light and filled with 3 gorgeous adult African violets, which were in full bloom. There was even a 4th spot where the old lady had planted a leaf to grow into the 4th flower. Standing in the flower room, Erickson felt compelled to talk. "I can see what your problem is," he began. "What do you mean?" said the old woman, obviously confused. Erickson turned towards her and looked her deep in her eyes and said, "You are a bad Christian." "What do you mean?" "Here you are with all of this money, time on your hands, and a green thumb, and it's all going to waste," Erickson explained. "In accordance with your family's wishes, I'm going to give you some prescriptions. I want those prescriptions carried out, so I will give them to your housekeeper tomorrow morning." The prescription: have your housekeeper buy an adult African violet of every hue that you do not own. Buy 50 potting plants. Buy a supply of soil. Buy 200 gift flower pots. My orders: every time a baby is born to a member of the church, send the baby an African violet. Every time a baby is christened, give them an African violet. Every time a church member gets sick, give them an African violet. Every time a girl announces her engagement, give them an African violet. Every time a couple gets married, give them an African violet. Every time there is a church bazaar, donate 12 to 20 of your African violets. Each time one of those events happens, have your handyman drive you to the home of the people who are affected by these happy or sad events. Bring them a plant and your congratulations or condolences and comfort, whichever is appropriate to the situation. After that advice, Erickson left and never spoke to the old woman again. 20 years later, Erickson told his teaching tale to a group of his students. He pulled out an old yellow Milwaukee newspaper article with the headline, African Violet Queen of Milwaukee dies, mourned by thousands. The formerly depressed and suicidal woman died fulfilled, with countless friends of all ages mourning the passing of their special friend. One of his students raised his hand and asked Erickson, "Why did you have her give out plants instead of treating her depression?" After pausing for what felt like an eternity for Erickson's curious students, he finally replied, "I looked around her house, and the only sign of life I saw was those African violets. I thought it would be easier to grow the African violets part of her life than to weed out the depression." The end. Congratulations again, fellow inductees.